Strategies for Change Masterclass Series: The History of the Treatment of Disabled People in Ireland with Dr Pauline Conroy.
Fiona said she wanted to talk about history and disabled people, and I think it's a really interesting topic because there's an uncanny neglect of history in most of the mission statements, laws, visions, strategies, reform documents. We never know what it is that came before these documents that the document is supposed to be improving. So you end up with documents that seem to be parachuted into the present, and you don't know what the past was. You don't know what it is they're going to do better next time. And I'm thinking to some of the witnesses to change and to existence, such as Paddy Doyle's memoir, The God Squad of 1988, or Breaking the Silence, The History of Deaf Education, which was 98, and that excellent book by The Walls of Silence by Annie Ryan on what happened to people like her son, who ended up in Portrane Asylum. So I'm thinking in relation to disability, a place to start is around the 1700s and the 1800s, that is after the Middle Ages. And after the 1700s, around there was the beginning of the confinement of people with disabilities into large prison-like institutions. And it's sometimes referred to now as the architecture of confinement. They were like prisons. And the first sign of it was when a house of industry was built in Smithfield, near Smithfield in Dublin. And this was a house to lock up the poor, the destitute, and especially beggars. There were especially a hatred of beggars in the city, and the rich didn't want to see the sight of them. So they would lock them up, and carts with horses would ride around the city at night, picking up beggars and destitute people and firing them into this house of industry. And they particularly picked up people who were unable to look after themselves, people who had mental issues, and disabled people of all kinds. So from this period of the 1700s, disability and poverty were locked together. And that's how the public were encouraged to see disability, not as a pervasive thinking across society, but as an issue related to paupers and the destitute. And they even went so far as to have badges, round circular badges. And if you were in the House of Industry and you behaved well, you could get a badge which allowed you to beg legally. And this was very popular among disabled people, who would then display in the street the absence of an arm or a leg. Donald Tolan used to call these the closed institutions. And he felt throughout his life of struggles, he felt very strongly about them and about their history. But we're really also talking at this time about how industrialization affected Ireland. Because if you take the late 1700s and the early 1800s, a lot of people worked at home. They produced goods, but say the weavers of the liberties, everybody in the family, men, women, and children, and anybody who had an impairment as well, they all worked. They worked as a unit and produced, for example, linen, or they worked with flax, or they made silk if they were very lucky. So industrialization actually wiped out that integration of the disabled person into an economic and family unit. And it was at that point that they became isolated. and abandoned by the emergence of workshops and factories from which they were excluded as unfit. And this was particularly the case after the Act of Union in 1801, which led to the collapse of a lot of the weavers' work, for example. And households became separate from employment. So you didn't work in your house anymore. You went out and looked for work in a workplace or a workshop. And this was the end of what you might call the domestic economy, the home-based economy. And as I said, disability was intrinsically associated with poverty and its counterpart, charity. So I was asking myself how it was that it is so hard for the concept of independent living to be understood unless you have a look at the history. And that first house of industry tells us a lot because it was built beside a deportation center for women. And it was also built alongside the first lunatic asylum and one of the first fever hospitals. So that tells us really that institutions were the Irish welfare state, not like in England or France or Germany. It was these very somber, enclosed buildings that were the Irish welfare state, and they continued to be built and built and built. And I did a count of some of them, of the asylums, the Magdalen laundries, the industrial schools, and the workhouses. And by 1900, there were 278 of these institutions on this small little island. 278. And it was based on the beginnings of these buildings that the parish system was residing. Now, by the parish system, I mean the system that the health board and the health services use today, which is if you want services, you can only get them in your own health board area or community health organization. The name keeps changing. But the concept is the same, is that the people of your parish or area are to provide the services, and you can only have them in the area from which you come. And this is strongly opposed by not only families and individuals, but also many professionals find this a very unacceptable system. For example, if you're homeless in Dunleary, but you were last living in Dublin, well, you get nothing in Dunleary, you have to go back to Dublin. Same if you're a drug addict, you won't get your methadone in Dunleary if your last place was in Cork, you have to go to Cork. So this rigidifies the system and makes it extremely inflexible. But there's another aspect of the gap that occurred when households and workplaces were separated. People were stranded without anywhere to go or what to do. And into Ireland, there came new colonizers, not the British, who are our usual colonizers. No, they came from religious orders, started moving in the 1800s into Ireland. And interestingly, they were extremely conservative. They were conservative because most of them came because they weren't wanted anymore in France or Italy or Belgium. There had been revolutions in some of their countries. There'd been the French Revolution. There'd been the 1848 year of revolutions. So these religious orders moved where they thought they could find a good clientele. And you have the Vincent de Paul, which was a very important one. They came in 1855 from Paris. You've the John of Gods, who came in 1882 from Portugal. The Sisters of Charity early on, 1815. The Brothers of Charity from France, 1807. The Bon Secours, 1861. The De La Salle brothers, who had in fact been founded in the hundreds, came into Dundalk in 1899, and the Daughters of Charity in 1855. That's just to mention a few. So what we had was a lot of extremely competitive religious orders looking for work to do and trying to decide who they would serve and from whom they would raise money in a charitable way to run their new institutions. And they were not so happy with the beginnings of an asylum system in Ireland. But they later decided it was a very good idea because none of them at all, wanted to look after people who had mental illness or people who had become quite acutely mentally ill. And they were delighted that the state was going to build all the asylums and run them as secular institutions. And they would have then the chance to mop up the others who were abandoned, such as those who lived in Magdalen laundries, later the children in industrial schools, later those who had come out of the workhouses. So these religious orders arrived in Ireland with a particular view, which was that you should keep everything very stable and as much as possible, very orderly and very confined. So they were almost militaristic in their approach. And they had some very, very strong leaders among the men and women in these orders. But when I said they were competitive, I mean seriously competitive. Like the Vincent de Paul arrived and it later fractured into 5 different other religious orders or groups who did not agree with each other and actually don't agree with each other to this day. So when the health service says they would like groups to work together, no way are some of these groups going to work together because they still consider the religious order down the road as heretical, not part of the same Catholic beliefs that they hold. Now, you could ask, what happened when Ireland became independent? Was 1922 a turning point for disabled people? And in my opinion, it was a step backwards, definitely not a turning point. After independence, the War of Independence was over and the Civil War was over. Around 1922, the leaders had to figure out what to do with this society that they were now running on their own. And one of the things they decided was to empty the workhouses. And there were a lot of workhouses. There were, how many? 164 of these institutions to be closed down if they could. But the trouble was they were not going to release people into freedom. They were going to put them in other institutions. And that is, for me, a fatal decision in terms of independent living, was that decision in the 1920s not to empty the workhouses for the people to be free and working, but actually to build more of them. And this was consolidated by a commission called the Relief of the Sick and the Destitute Poor. So they divided up those who were in the workhouses into more industrial schools, more hospitals, Magdalen laundries, and renamed the workhouse as a county home. And asylums became mental hospitals, and each got a saint's name. That was the most significant change, was the saint's name. So you had St. Ita's, St. Bridget's in RD, you had St. Sennans down in Wexford. They all got a saint's name, but what actually went on inside didn't change. Now, they were wondering what to do with disabled people. A lot of disabled people were not only in the lunatic asylums, as they were then, but they were also in the workhouse. So they started, I suppose, asking around, would anyone like to take disabled people into their institution? And they particularly were keen for Stewart's Hospital, on the outskirts of Dublin to take disabled people in. And Stuart said no, not because they didn't want to, but because they thought their system wasn't working. They were not good enough. They hadn't thought out what they were doing, and they felt they had nothing to offer. And you see, the asylums at the time were not just for people who were allegedly insane. When I looked at some asylums there, who was in them, say, in 1901 or 1911, and I added them all up. I put them on a spreadsheet and added them all up to see who was actually there. I found children who were not supposed to be there. I found blind. I found people with epilepsy, people delirious from infections, people delirious from syphilis, and people who were described as disappointed in love. People who had been abandoned by their fiancé or seduced by a fiancé and became melancholic, and they were pushed into the asylum. So asylums were full of people who were not mentally ill, not. And in 1923, just a year after independence, a very important law was passed by Doyle. And this was a law to disenfranchise both the poor and the disabled, people who were inside institutions. It was a law which said anyone resident in one of these institutions shall not be considered resident for the purposes of exercising the franchise. So if you lived in any of the institutions, you had no right to vote. And I haven't been able myself to explore the implications of that, the meaning. I know it means that people were second class, but it actually means they weren't citizens either. They didn't have the vote. So it was a sort of new colonization. It was a step backwards from the position before 1922. Now, I don't know how many people in institutions would have voted, but they had theoretically the right to vote. So after 1922, people who were in these institutions, disabled people, lived in a state of apartheid. Now, we usually associate apartheid with South Africa, but apartheid is actually a word from Dutch, apartheid. It means apartness, simply. So it was presumed that disabled people would live apart and separate from everybody else. Now, one of the most peculiar results of this was when TB broke out in Ireland in the 1930s. And there was a suggestion discussed in Parliament that people with TB could live in a colony, a self-sufficient colony, which would be established, the first one, at Peamount Sanatorium. Yes, and I see Paul smiling at me here on the right because he knows all about it. And they decided to set up some industries in Peamount for people to work. And the idea was that this would spread all over Ireland. But of course it didn't. And it degenerated into a totally different type of institution. But what was clear in the thinking is that with this, what I'm calling coercive confinement, disabled people were presumed to be dependent always on others. They were not to have interpersonal relationships. They were not to form families. They were not to have sexual or emotional feelings like everyone else. And in fact, they were not to be allowed to have families. They were to be kept separate so that they wouldn't have families. And parents were told that for the sake of their family and the other children, it was best to give up their children to the nuns or the brothers or the priests. and to avoid the so-called burden that disabled people would be on family. So it was suggested by religious orders, not by the Pope, not by Vatican, that family life and family development was incompatible with disabled people, that there was a profound separation there. And this is partly the source of this institutional economy and charity economy. If I could give just one example, St. John of God's, for example, in 2020 had an income of 34 million euros, 34 million. The amount it spent on day services was 6%. So 94% of its budget is spent on non-family arrangements, institutions that confine, and institutional thinking and rigidity about the life that disabled people might have. Now, when we look back at the past, we assume that incrementally, bit by bit, things will get better. But as I've described to you, after 1922, it is my belief that things got worse. In the 1990s, there was quite a bit of optimism that things could change and that you could move fairly easily between a charity model, which was dominant up to then, to a rights model, particularly via the thinking of a social dimension to life with disability. And there was, in 1996, the passage of an Employment Equality Act, and which among the grounds of which, in terms of discrimination, among the grounds was a disability ground, but that immediately, of all the grounds, including homosexuality and family status, among all the grounds, this was the one that caused the most problems. This was the one where the disability ground was the one that ended up in court, as people opposed having a ground for disability that would generate disability discrimination court cases and confer rights on people with disabilities. Now, that disability ground was challenged, and eventually it became part of the Equal Status Act and the Employment Equality Act. But there was a battle over it, which lasted about 5 years, completely unexpected. And during that period, many activists said, look, we've had enough of this sharing with all the other grounds. We need our own Disability Act. And that was the beginnings of the campaign called Get Your Act Together. Yeah, to identify a specific legal basis for disability. Now, one of the things that the disability ground and the employment equality ground did during this period, and it wasn't noticed very much, was that it also created a ground for unequal pay. Up to then, all equality legislation was on the assumption equal treatment, equal grounds, equal pay for all, so long as the work was the same and of equal value could be attributed if the work was not the same. But they put in Article 34.3, which said that in certain instances, depending on the work done, unequal pay was permitted. That is, it was not a ground for discrimination. Now, what was the background to that? Well, the background to that was that some people had had the nerve to seek plain jobs, such as cleaning in the local authority, brushing the streets outside the local authority's offices, very small jobs, and they wanted minimum pay. They wanted the same hourly rate as anyone else doing that job. And local authorities and others didn't want to give them equal pay, didn't want it at all. And their lobby was successful. And into the Act went the first ever permission for discrimination, for unequal pay. And it was primarily to prevent disabled people getting the same pay as everyone else in law. Now, at the same time, disabled people had never been included in the social protection system. They weren't mentioned in social welfare. There was nothing. And after the Second World War, and I say that because a lot of people came back to Ireland injured from the Second World War. They had fought with the British Army and had come back to Ireland, in some cases physically injured and missing limbs, and in other cases suffering from shell shock or post-traumatic stress. And it was decided in 1954, which is a good few years after the war ended, that it might be possible to give a small grant to people who were disabled and lived at home. But it had to be small, very small, so that it wouldn't be a burden on the public purse. So the amount they thought of was £1. 1954, £1. Now, £1 in 54 is what an unskilled agricultural labourer could expect in a week. £1. And it was to be given under very stringent conditions of means testing. You had to be very destitute. Many civil servants were opposed to it. They said this could get completely out of hand, giving people a grant. But they didn't allow it to go into the Department of Social Welfare. The grant was to be paid under a medical model. So the grant went into the health boards of the time. And the health boards wreaked vengeance. So when people asked and applied for this £1 grant, some health boards disqualified 80% of the applicants, so they didn't get it. That remained the case until 1986, when there was a recommendation by the Commission on Social Welfare that it should be transferred to the Department of Social Welfare, and that eventually happened. But that means that from 1922 until 1986 and later, disabled people did not exist inside the social welfare system. They were ghosts. They weren't there. Now, the next landmark was, I think, the Commission on the Status of People with Disabilities reporting for the first time and expressing a voice of disabled people in a form of a movement. And it has 14 pages of very interesting recommendations, among which are a cost of disability payment, which has never been accepted. Never been accepted that there are extra costs, and that these costs are not real and not luxury, they are daily need. And it was after that the Forum of People with Disabilities was founded by many activists and other supporters. But later, the Commission to Inquire into Child Abuse reported in 2009, and it then became clear that those children who had gone to special schools or schools for the deaf or schools for the blind had suffered extreme forms of abuse. And I wrote about this. I went through the volumes of the Commission's inquiry, and I picked out all the reports of children who were disabled and who came to the Commission as adults and reported their experiences, experiences in hospitals, experiences in schools, experiences in special schools. And this is very much what would have been the thoughts of Paddy Doyle. He describes his experience, and it's exactly as described in the Commission to Inquire into Child Abuse. So I was able to find 100 cases of disabled children been severely, severely psychologically and physically tormented and abused. And this was still denied in 2009, denied by those who ran those particular schools. And during the same time, I have to say, I found in the last 10 years that the social model, so-called, has been increasingly hijacked by people in services and in bodies who make declarations that their service is following a social model. And I regard this as very Catholic. That is, you make a declaration of an act of faith, and everybody is expected to believe and have faith in that declaration. But there's no evidence that many of these bodies and services are in fact following the social model. And when you actually attempt to get into some of their buildings, it's not possible. Not possible. They're completely inaccessible. Or you get to the ground floor and there's no lift. Now, you will recall, many of you, that there is supposed to be a mobility allowance, such as there is in Northern Ireland, that would allow people to have autonomy over transport, and that it was closed down and it was never resurrected again. It hasn't been reintroduced. So I want to mention just one last landmark in our history, which is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities 2006, which Ireland ratified in 2018 under constant pressure and protests and gatherings outside government buildings. Ireland signed it, but it's not widely known that they signed it with reservations. There were 3 areas that they wanted to dissociate themselves from. The first was Article 27, and they didn't want the disability and equal treatment in employment and occupation. They didn't want that to apply to, I'm reading, Defence Forces, An Garda Síochána, the Prison Service, the Fire Brigade, the Irish Coast Guard, and the Ambulance Service. So any people who applied for admission to or service in any of these could be turned away, and that would not be discrimination and not be contrary to the convention. So that's the reservation on Article 27.1. They then objected also to the absence of substitute decision-making inside the convention. And they said there should be substitute decision-making in appropriate circumstances and subject to appropriate and effective safeguards. And that actually is the case. In decision-making, all the wards of court will change to become persons with substitute decision-making. But there's no provision for that in the convention. But Ireland has made sure that their insurance policy paid by writing it into their reservation on Article 12. And finally, is those who are under treatment for mental difficulties. It says it's under Ireland's understanding of the convention is that it does allow for compulsory care or treatment, including treatment of mental disorders when circumstances render treatment of this kind as a last resort, and the treatment is subject to legal standards. Now, I would love to have a long-standing debate on these reservations, which we don't have enough discussion about, particularly as they're in 3 different areas, quite different areas. But Ireland was smart enough to get in early with their reservations and to avoid them appearing on most of the websites. So if you go to the websites that show the convention in Ireland, most of them don't have the reservations on them. They don't tell you that there are reservations. What they do tell you is that Ireland hasn't signed the protocol. to the convention, and that's where most of the problem is alive. Finally, I want to say that today, I think it's widely viewed that people have rights as individuals as opposed to categories of people, and that there is now an end to this categorization, though you still find it in the Department of Education, for example. We still have 1,300 people under 65 living in nursing homes. So there is a search for an institution for some disabled people, and in the absence of any, or the right to live at home with extensive care, they end up in nursing homes. And just 2,552 disabled people got a PA service according to the HSE's service plan for 2021. A mere fraction of those declaring themselves having needs within the census. What the Disability Federation of Ireland have said about the current plans for disabled people in Ireland is that there is a need to spend another 550 million euros to redress some of the gaps that are appearing in the services. I thank you for your patience in listening to me for so long and for the opportunity to share my views.
Pauline has written a book called A Bit Different: Disability in Ireland, and it can be purchased in any good bookstore and on Amazon.com as a Kindle edition.